In the Free State of the Congo, a hand was worth the same as a life. The system was as follows. Every bullet fired had to be justified. Every soldier who pulled the trigger had to provide physical proof. And the proof was a hand, one for each shot, one for each body, supposedly killed in the name of the King of the Belgians. For decades, every kilometer of African jungle that became a source of rubber, ivory, or wood did so at the cost of bodies. Black bodies, invisible to Europe, but fundamental to the progress reports sent to Brussels. The soldiers of the Force Publique, many of them also natives forced to serve, were given a rifle and a mandate to get results. These results were not measured in battles won or enemies defeated, but in numbers. How many kilos of rubber? How many hands amputated? Each bullet had to be justified with physical proof. And if the body wasn't there, then the hand had to be. Amputations became routine. When a soldier fired and didn't kill, or if a bullet was lost, the easiest thing was to enter a village, choose at random, and cut. Sometimes they were men, sometimes women, many times children. If someone fled, the rest of the village paid. If the quota wasn't met, the entire village was burned. Soldiers chained up the men, raped the women, executed whoever was necessary, and in the end, collected hands. It was a production system. Only instead of machinery, there were machetes. Belgian officers not only allowed it, they rewarded it. In many stations, the collected hands were hung as a warning. In others, they were buried in boxes and sent as proof of efficiency. There were no trials, no accountability, just reports, statistics, and satisfied telegrams crossing the ocean. In Europe, Leopold II was considered a benefactor. He called himself the Builder King, or even the Philanthropist King. He had financed hospitals, restored monuments, created botanical gardens. His public image was impeccable. He even presented his African dominion as a civilizing mission. He spoke of Christianizing the savages, of bringing schools, of eradicating Arab slavery. But behind that facade, there was a machinery of death. Leopold never set foot in the Congo, not even once, but the entire apparatus functioned under his direct control. It wasn't a Belgian colony, it was his personal property. The Free State of the Congo did not answer to the parliament, it answered to him. Every concessionaire company, every officer, every shipment filled his pockets. The testimonies that began to arrive from missionaries, explorers, or the few journalists who dared to speak were hard to believe. Women executed in front of their children, villages forced to hand over hostages, and if they didn't comply, their heads were sent by mail. It was a regime of absolute terror, without law, without restraint, without a soul. For Europeans, it was a scandal. For the Congo, it was routine. And while all this was happening, Leopold II attended receptions, organized banquets, and expanded his palace. He had built a private empire on blood and silence, and he had no intention of letting go. This is the beginning of that story. Who was Leopold II? He was born in 1835, the son of Leopold I, the first king of Belgium. From a young age, it was clear that he was not made to govern with his heart. He grew up in a cold, rigid environment, marked by discipline and an obsession with duty. He was not charismatic. He was not well-liked among the nobility, nor among the people. But what he did have was an overwhelming ambition, and a cold, meticulous, strategic mind. From a young age, he trained in politics, economics, and administration, and he had a clear goal to turn Belgium into a power. But he wouldn't achieve it in Europe. His sights were set on Africa. When he ascended the throne in 1865, Belgium was a small country, without colonies, without a strong army, without an empire. While France, the United Kingdom, and Germany expanded their territories, his only reward was frustration and an obsession to have the same, or more. But there was a problem. The Belgian parliament did not want colonial adventures. They didn't want wars, risks, or unnecessary expenses. So Leopold sought another path. If he couldn't conquer Africa in the name of Belgium, he would do it in his own name. And he did it in silence. For years, he wove a network of diplomatic, political, and media influences. He financed expeditions, organized congresses, created committees with humanitarian names against Arab slavery to bring Christianity. It was all a facade. Behind that mask, his true plan, to take over a vast African territory and exploit it as his private enterprise. His big move came in 1884 at the Berlin Conference. The European powers were dividing Africa like cutting a cake, and there, thanks to his image as a civilized man and his diplomatic pressure, Leopold achieved the unthinkable, recognition of his control over a gigantic piece of the continent, right in the heart of Africa. Thus was born the Free State of the Congo. But pay attention, it was not a Belgian colony, it was not a protectorate, it was his, personally his. An entire country turned into the private property of the king. From that moment, Leopold II ceased to be just a monarch. He became an entrepreneur, an owner, an exploiter. Every concession to extract rubber or ivory passed through his hands. Every punitive expedition against a village that didn't meet the quota had his approval, directly or indirectly. The entire power apparatus in the Congo answered to him, and every coin generated by that hell ended up in his personal accounts. Meanwhile, in Belgium, his image was impeccable. He was seen as a modern king. He built monuments, beautified cities, financed parks, museums, gardens. He portrayed himself as a lover of art, as a man concerned with progress. But all of that was financed by the suffering of millions. Leopold II was not a madman, nor was he an impulsive tyrant. He was something much more dangerous, a bureaucrat of horror, cold, calculating, ambitious. Every death, every mutilation, every burned village had his invisible signature behind it. He ruled Belgium for over 40 years, and he built his personal empire on the ashes of a continent. That was Leopold II, the Free State of the Congo and the business of horror. The Free State of the Congo was not just any colony. It was a monstrous experiment, a territory 80 times larger than Belgium, governed not by a country, but by a single man. There was no parliament, no rights, no fair laws. Everything responded to one objective: to generate wealth. For whom? For Leopold II. And that wealth had a name: rubber. With the Industrial Revolution, Europe needed rubber like never before. Tires, cables, machines. Congo latex was worth its weight in gold. But extracting it was not easy. It required thousands of arms, millions of hands, contracts, salaries. No. What existed were entire villages forced to work. One by one, they were subjected to quotas. Every man had to deliver a certain amount of rubber within a specific time. If he failed, he paid. And his entire community paid too. The punishments were so cruel that they seemed to come from a nightmare. They burned villages, took women and children hostage, and if you still didn't comply, they mutilated you. Feet, ears, hands. Yes, hands. Because every bullet used by a soldier had to be justified. How? With the right hand, cut off the enemy. But many times, there was no enemy. Then, the hand was taken from whoever was nearby, whether a child, an elder, or an innocent. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was control. The private army of the Congo, the famous Force Publique, was a machine of terror. African troops led by white officers armed to the teeth. They weren't there to protect. They were there to punish. If a village delivered little rubber, punishment. If someone fled, pursuit. If a family tried to hide their children, total punishment. There was no mercy, no escape. And although it may seem impossible to believe, all this was documented. The first to raise their voices were European missionaries. They saw with their own eyes the whippings, the chained bodies, the dying children. They wrote letters, sent reports, described razed villages, improvised cemeteries along the roads, crops rotting due to lack of hands to harvest them. But their voice was weak. Leopold had total control of the propaganda. He paid journalists, financed publications, discredited critics, and meanwhile, he continued selling his image, the enlightened king, the great civilizer. The truth, meanwhile, remained buried in the jungles. How many died? There is no exact figure, but the most conservative estimates speak of between 8 and 10 million people. Other sources raise the number even higher. And it wasn't just from murders. It was from untreated diseases, from exhaustion, from malnutrition, from poorly treated wounds. It was a silent, sustained, legalized extermination machine. It didn't use gas chambers or ovens. It used neglect. And while all this was happening, in Europe, Leopold lived like a fairy tale king. Palaces, art, gardens, donations to churches, squares, and hospitals, and all of it paid for with the horror of the Congo. He said he had brought civilization, that he had eliminated Arab slavery, that he had organized a modern system. But what he really did was build a hell with his signature at the bottom. And the most disturbing thing is this: no one stopped him. The European powers knew what was happening. They had reports, photos, testimonies, but they looked the other way. Why? Because the Congo didn't bother them. It didn't cause wars. It didn't generate diplomatic conflicts. It only generated cheap rubber and millions in profits for a distant king. Leopold II didn't just create a colony. He created a model, a legal hell, a perfect exploitation system, where the wheels turned in Europe and the bodies fell in Africa. The Baringa Massacre, year 1899. The troops of the Force Publique arrived in the village with a clear order: more rubber, faster, and with exemplary punishment. First, they surrounded everything. Then they gathered the community in the square. Elders, women, children. No one escaped. The elders tried to speak. They said that the harvest had been bad, that they would do their best to make up for it, that they just needed time. But they hadn't come for explanations. They came for blood. A Belgian officer climbed onto an improvised platform and read out a list of names. They were the local leaders, the first 3, executed in front of everyone, without trial, without a word, just bullets. The next ones had their arms tied with thick ropes, and they were dragged across the dirt ground until they stopped moving. One, who had been the village healer, received something worse. They cut off his testicles and shoved them into his mouth before slitting his throat. Not out of hate, they said, by order. Because respect had to be taught. The women were separated, not out of compassion. They were tied together and raped for hours. Some died that same night, others days later. Those who survived were left marked by lashes, by bayonet wounds, or by fire. The children didn't escape either, but they weren't killed. Their hands were cut off, not because they had done anything, but because hands were the currency. Every bullet used by a soldier had to be justified. 1 bullet, 1 hand. That's how the system worked. If you fired, you had to bring back the hand of the person you killed to prevent soldiers from wasting ammunition. And if no one was killed, Well, they found a hand anyway, from anyone, a child, an elder. It didn't matter. In Baringa, the hands were piled into baskets. Some still twitched, some belonged to children who were still alive. But no one cried anymore. Only the buzzing of flies could be heard, and the laughter of the soldiers. One of them took a photo. In the image, a father sits on the ground, looking at his daughter's feet. She is 5 years old, and she has no hands. That photo traveled around the world. But it changed nothing, because Baringa wasn't an isolated case. It wasn't the only one. It wasn't the worst. It was just one of many. What made it different was that someone spoke up, a white missionary who couldn't take it anymore, who wrote letters, who took notes, who showed evidence. And so Baringa became a signal, a spark, something impossible to ignore. Because Leopold II never set foot in the Congo. He never saw a mutilated child with his own eyes. He never heard the screams. But he did read the reports. He did sign the decrees. He did collect every coin. The horror wasn't accidental. It was his system. And Baringa was the beginning of the end, because denial wasn't enough anymore. Silencing wasn't enough anymore. The image of the girl without hands was everywhere. Even so, it would take time for the king to fall. Because as long as the rubber kept flowing, as long as Europe's factories kept producing, protests would remain just that. Distant noise. It begins to reverberate in Europe. The Free State of the Congo was presented as a brilliant example of civilization, a humanitarian jewel. According to Leopold II, schools were being built there, tribes were being protected, Arab slavery was being eradicated. Everything sounded good. But it was all a big lie, and slowly it began to crack. The first to break the silence were not politicians or newspapers. They were solitary witnesses, missionaries, diplomats, travelers, people who had seen the nightmare with their own eyes, children with stumps where hands once were, women chained to trees, elders hung upside down until they died. These weren't rumors. These were real scenes, with names, dates, places, and they started writing it all down. Letters, diaries, reports. At first they were ignored, many were silenced, but the tide didn't stop. The truth already had shape. One of the first to shout it was George Washington Williams, African-American, historian, and witness. In 1890, he traveled to the Congo, and upon returning had no doubts this was slavery disguised as administration. He wrote about it, he denounced it, he shouted it. His report was brutal. But the reaction was lukewarm. The king's defenders called him exaggerated, ridiculed his words. Leopold cunningly managed to weather the blow, but the crack had already formed, and then came a harder, more unexpected blow. Edmond Dean Morel was not an activist or journalist. He was an employee of a shipping company. His job was to inspect cargo between Belgium and the Congo, and there he noticed the pattern, ships going full of weapons, and returning loaded with rubber and ivory. But they never carried goods for trade. There was no commerce, just violent extraction. Morel understood that what was happening was plunder, and he decided to confront the richest king in Europe. From England, he founded the Congo Reform Association. He wrote pamphlets, gave speeches, sent letters to newspapers, politicians, churches. But words were no longer enough. People needed to see, and that's when the images arrived. The first photographs came from Protestant missions, and they left no room for doubt. Children with their arms cut off, women with whip scars, men in chains, alive but empty. These were real images, raw, heart-wrenching, impossible to ignore. They were published in magazines, pasted on the walls of Parliament, shown at conferences. The story was no longer a suspicion. It was proof. Then Roger Casement entered the scene. British diplomat. He was sent to the Congo to investigate, and what he found was worse than they imagined. His report meticulously detailed the massacres, the mutilations, the collective punishments. It described how soldiers burned villages for not delivering enough rubber, how they murdered children to punish parents, how human hands were used as a measure of labor. It was so horrific that many thought he exaggerated, but he didn't. And the scandal exploded. Newspapers called it the Congolese hell. In parliaments, answers were demanded. Cartoonists drew Leopold II with a crown of skulls. The philanthropist king was beginning to crumble. And how did Leopold respond? As always, with manipulation. He hired journalists, historians, diplomats, paid for neutral studies to clean his image, published pamphlets with nice titles like Progress in the Congo, where he talked about railways, hospitals, schools, all whitewashed, all false. But it wasn't enough anymore. Even in Belgium, critical voices began to emerge. Some deputies demanded audits. Others openly spoke of crimes against humanity. Leopold exploded with rage, denied everything, said it was slander from Protestants and the British, that the Congolese were savages who didn't understand civilization, that the mutilations were internal, between tribes, that rubber was collected peacefully. He lied coldly, but no one listened to him the same way anymore. And then came the final blow. In 1904, an international commission traveled to the Congo. They weren't enemies of the king. They were envoys from European governments, serious people, with connections, with power. And what they saw couldn't be covered up. The final report left no doubt. The Free State of the Congo was a system of terror, a regime of slavery, a machine of death. It was the beginning of the end. But Leopold didn't give up. He kept fighting, kept amassing wealth, kept lying. He still had allies. He still had fear to instill. But what he didn't have was control over the truth. Because now, the truth was unstoppable. The end of Leopold II. Leopold denied everything until the last second. He claimed it was all lies, part of a British campaign to discredit Belgium. But it no longer worked. The evidence was so overwhelming that even his best army of propagandists couldn't cover it up. And the worst part, it wasn't just missionaries or activists accusing him anymore. Now it was governments, parliaments, newspapers from all over the world. In France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States. Everyone was talking about the horror in the Congo, with names, with dates, with photos. Yes, the photos kept circulating, images of mutilations, executions, men tied up like animals, children without arms. It was no longer speculation. It was a truth as raw as the blood-stained rubber. And in Belgium, the scandal exploded. The crown began to wobble. In 1904, the blow that left him no margin arrived. The international commission that investigated on the ground delivered its verdict. And although it was composed of representatives from countries allied with Leopold, they couldn't hide it. What they saw was so monstrous that the report had no possible whitewashing. Crimes, slavery, systematic violence, it was official. The report was made public. All of Europe read it with a sickened stomach. And in Belgium, Parliament could no longer look the other way. For years, options were debated, because of course it wasn't easy. How do you take a colony away from a king who considers it his private property? How do you tell Leopold II that his personal empire is no longer his? But finally, in 1908, the only possible solution arrived. Leopold was forced to hand over control of the Congo. Not out of guilt, not out of repentance, not out of decency, It was a forced surrender. The Free State of the Congo disappeared. The Belgian Congo was born, now under state control, and Leopold received a fortune as compensation. Yes, he was paid, as if he had sold a farm with millions of people inside. He didn't lose money, but he lost power, and most importantly, he lost the facade. The image of the philanthropist king, the great civilizer, had collapsed. He was exposed, naked, for what he truly was, a tyrant stained with blood. He tried to save his reputation. He ordered documents destroyed, letters burned, memoirs censored. He did the impossible to rewrite history. But it was too late. The cartoons depicted him crowned with skulls. The protests called him a murderer. He had gone from hero to villain, and then his end came. In 1909, a year after the transfer of the Congo, Leopold II died, alone, without glory, without affection. The people did not mourn his death. On the contrary, in front of the royal palace, many applauded when his coffin was carried out. They applauded, yes, but not out of respect, out of relief. The king of the Congo was dead, but his shadow remained, because the damage had already been done. Millions of lives had been shattered, entire communities wiped out. The land turned into a forced labor camp. Leopold's legacy didn't end with his death. It continued to mark the region for decades. The Free State of the Congo disappeared from the map, but the horror was written into history. What happened to the Belgian Congo? After the death of Leopold II in 1909, the dreaded Free State of the Congo ceased to exist, at least on paper. But changing its name did not mean the end of suffering. There was no redemption, no justice, no reparations, only a change of hands, from the king to the Belgian state, and with it, a new name, Belgian Congo. Now, everything was legal. Everything had institutions, laws, structures. But the rules still came from Brussels. The colony remained what it had always been, a rich territory governed by a foreign power that sought only one thing: to exploit its resources to the maximum. Theoretically, this new phase was supposed to be more benevolent than the hell under Leopold. But in practice, the abuses continued, just with a different uniform. Forced labor still existed, only with a more diplomatic veneer. The lands remained in the hands of large companies, many of them foreign, and education, if it could even be called that, was minimal, controlled by missionaries who taught more religion than rights. The Congolese population had no voice or vote. They couldn't elect leaders. They couldn't participate in decisions. They lived under rules imposed by another continent, and while the people survived, Belgium filled its pockets. The Congo became key to the Belgian economy. Beneath its soil lay true treasures: copper, tin, diamonds, gold, uranium, minerals that would fuel wars, industries, even nuclear bombs. And while tons of wealth were extracted, millions of Congolese remained trapped in extreme poverty. Cities grew. Trains, ports, and buildings were constructed, but all under a brutal model of segregation. The whites were on top, with power, luxuries, privileges. The Congolese were below, obeying orders, without rights, without a future. Racism wasn't just cultural, it was a state policy. And so the decades passed, until in 1960, the world changed. International pressure, and especially internal pressure, forced Belgium to grant independence. But it wasn't an exemplary transition. It was fast, improvised, chaotic. In less than 6 months, the country went from being a tightly controlled colony to a republic that had to govern itself. Without experience, without structure, without preparation. And the inevitable happened. Everything exploded. Independence was proclaimed, yes. The Democratic Republic of the Congo was born. But soon after, chaos engulfed everything. Patrice Lumumba, the prime minister who had fought for independence, was assassinated just a year later. The crime involved foreign powers, former colonial officials, and made it clear that colonialism hadn't left. It had simply changed form. From there, another nightmare began. Dictatorships, coups d'état, foreign interventions, and above all, an endemic corruption that seemed directly inherited from Leopold II. For more than 3 decades, Mobutu Sese Seko ruled with an iron fist. He changed the country's name to Zaire, eliminated European flags and symbols, but kept the most important thing, the model of absolute power, repression, and plunder. When Mobutu fell in the 1990s, many thought peace would finally arrive. But no, the country entered one of the darkest periods in its history, the First and Second Congo Wars, considered among the deadliest conflicts since World War II. It is estimated that between 5 and 6 million people died. Yes, millions. It was a war involving guerrillas, neighboring countries, foreign powers, multinational corporations, thirsty for coltan and diamonds, and ethnic militias. The suffering of the civilian population was indescribable. And today, the Congo remains trapped. It is still one of the richest countries in the world in terms of resources, but also one of the hardest hit by poverty, violence, and instability. Armed groups control entire regions. The illegal extraction of coltan, gold, and diamonds continues to fund silent wars. And while multinational corporations make billions, many families live without clean water, without electricity, without a future. The legacy of Leopold II didn't end with his death. It lives on. It transformed into a system, a political culture, structural inequality. In Belgium, there are still statues of him in parks, and many still downplay what happened, as if it were all a story of the past, when the truth is that the damage continues to bleed in the present. From its creation, the Congo state was cursed, and to this day, the Democratic Republic of the Congo continues to fight to emerge from the abyss others dug, a country with a broken soul, but with a strength that still endures.